Well, Bob Allison, thank you so much for joining me in this s- special interview. I am sitting in Tangier, Morocco. The entire world, Moroccans and the entire world, is completely absorbed in the outcome of the U.S. presidential elections. And there's so much noise in the media, a lot of false analysis, a lot of this same thing. So I brought with me, before before I ask you, before we go into this conversation, I want to introduce you first, and then share with you some things that I was able to put together very quickly, so we can make it as they could be the basis of our conversation. So first of all, you are. You are the Franklin-esque scholar historian that I know of. I mean, you've you are the eminent historian of Boston, and you're one of the great historians of the American Revolution.
Go on, go
You
on, go on, Andrew.
Yes, you studied
Thank you.
with now
Very
you
generous.
studied with Bernard Bailyn, the eminent dean of the American Revolution. Actually, you co-edited a book with him uh, on the essential debate on the Constitution. You wrote about the American Revolution, a book which I have here in front of me, and about the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, Stephen Decatur, and the book that got me to know you is the Crescent Obscured, the relations between the United States and the Barbary Coast and all the North African corsairs, whatever you want to call them, which led me. So you, by merely reading that book, which was given to me by my late friend Jack Downs, you steered my path in a new direction in scholarship. So I spent at least 1 year or two just studying that aspect of American history, especially its relationships with the Mediterranean and the Muslims. And so you've done so much. You're also a professor of history and language and global culture at Suffolk University. You teach at the Harvard Extension School. You're the president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and the chair of Revolution 250, a consortium of organizations planning commemorations of the Revolution 250th anniversaries. And of course, you're a life trustee of the U.S. Constitution Museum, which I had the honor of visiting and participating in very briefly, thanks to you, and so on. And you do so many other things. So you're the absolute perfect person to talk to about the outcome of the presidential elections, especially in light of the deep ideological biases that have been part of the mainstream media now for a while. And the question I have for you before I move on to other things is I want to quote something from your book, The American Revolution. And here you say, when the Alien and Sedition Act was passed, it was aimed at the Republican press. The sedition law made it a federal offense to write, publish, or utter anything that might bring the president or Congress into contempt, hatred, or ridicule. 14 newspapers editors and one congressman were jailed for sedition. And this is something that Thomas Jefferson called the reign of the witches.
Yes.
And later on in the book, when Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated as president of the United States, he reflected on what you call the contest of opinion through which the nation had just passed, saying the intensity of public discussions might alarm strangers unused to saying what they think. But now that the matter was decided in accordance with the Constitution, all would peacefully go about their business. And even further on, he says, and that's what you're saying, he says, if any man wanted to dissolve the Union as the Federalists had accused the Republicans, or alter its Republican nature as the Republicans had charged the Federalists, let them stand undisturbed as monuments to the freedom with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. And then his belief was limited government resting on informed opinion was the touchstone of Jefferson's political faith and the faith of the American Revolution. And which leads me to ask you a very strange question. If Jefferson were alive today, would he have voted for Donald Trump?
Well, the good thing is we don't know. It's always hard to think how someone would have acted, and usually we want them to be on our side. So naturally, he would be on whatever side I am on or whatever side you are on. It's one of the great things about Jefferson, but it's also true of most historical figures. We don't know. We always think we want them to like us. It's not that we are trying to get right with them so much as we are hoping they will be right with us and think exactly what we are doing is what they had in mind. That is, we see that the revolution really was done so that we can be doing this, and we don't know. I don't know for whom he would have voted, and it's hard to tell even during his lifetime who he voted for. He does tell John Adams that, of course, he had supported John Quincy for president, which is probably true in 1824, but we don't know. Gee, I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I didn't go to the voting booth and say, "Gee, what would Jefferson do?" But maybe we should.
And I also want to quote something before, again, this is a little prompt for us to have a conversation. So in 2017, July 28, 2017, writing for the Times Literary Supplement, Edward Lutwak, the columnist, the writer, so on, the author of the book, The Endangered American Dream, was published in 93, wrote this. In that article, he wrote, the victory of the only Sanders counterpart on the Republican side, now we're talking about the 2016 election, with whom Sanders differed sharply on almost everything, except for the only thing that really mattered to both, the urgent need to mobilize government policies to increase American jobs and wages, in firm opposition to all the competing international and planetary priorities continuously proffered by elite Americans and their core institutions. And then he adds in the same article, Lutwak writes, the class contempt of respectable Republicans for the aging Don Juan, with his hopelessly vulgar blue-collar tasters in everything from his hairstyle to his food, and Toulouse recognizes a French writer as much in her resolutely non-negative Dans la tête de Donald Trump, whose own authentically feminine sensibility is openly on display when she writes, arrive le Donald avec un bison dans la prairie, comme un taureau dans le rodeo, comme le shérif dans un western. So it's like here's a Donald who comes like a bison in the prairie, like a bull in the rodeo, and like a sheriff in a western. So it is this image that is made to, this is the image of this vulgar American daring to occupy, to run for the presidency and even win.
Right.
That seems somewhat disturbing to the elites.
Yes. Yeah. There was a cartoon in the New Yorker in 2016 of a group of New York socialites sitting around saying it's not his policies that alarm me so much as what he'll do redecorating the White House. And you can see that similar thing in other disruptors who have come onto the scene, like Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, others who actually get to the root of things. And, we had one of the real virtues I see in Trump is had he not run, we would have had a race between Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton in 2016. And what could say more about the kind of decline of American democracy, that the only people we can think to be in power are the son and brother of one president, the wife of another. As we get into a hereditary system where we look to an elite kind of to provide us with leaders. And Trump isn't a man of the people, though he seems like one. He's done very well in life, and he is a celebrity. But then there have been other celebrities. I think this is one of the key things in the election we just had. It was a race between the elite composed of the celebrities and everyone else. And it turns out that there is more of everyone else than there are of the, Beyoncé's, Bruce Springsteen's, and others who will come out and tell us how to vote and fall in line. So that's, I think, one of the things I see in this election. It really is a reflection of democracy with a small d. And we've heard these dire warnings about the death of democracy from people who've been, propping up a guy who is really beyond his capabilities and saying everything is fine. And then said, well, we can't, he's actually not going to win. So we'll replace him with someone else without anyone voting on this matter. And So that I think is one of the real things we see coming out of this, and reflecting also that it is a government still with checks and balances. I think we see one person as president, but that person is part of a system, and it's not only a system with the three branches of the federal government, but also 50 states, which are intended to be laboratories of democracy, as Louis Brandeis said. So you have a system, and someone like Trump comes along and disrupts it, which is very alarming to those who have been able just to coast along saying, we're better than you are. And that's, you don't get very far in a political system where it rests on votes by saying, we're better than you are. There's a famous Boston story I won't tell you right now about, Elliot Richardson, very distinguished man. He had been Attorney General in the Nixon administration, quintessential New England Brahmin. The Brahmins are the kind of the ruling caste in Boston, and he becomes kind of a hero for standing up to Nixon, resigning instead of firing the special prosecutor in 1973, running for governor of Massachusetts. And Bill Bolger, the president of the state Senate, has an annual St. Patrick's Day roast where he welcomes Elliot Richardson to it. And he says, thank you, you're running for governor. And he holds up a newspaper with the headline, vote for L. He's better than you are. And that pretty much killed Richardson's campaign. But that was the perception. He's a guy we can praise better than we are. So.
Yeah, and so I had saved issues of Time magazine from when Trump was first elected in 2016. Yeah. And so the commentary is remarkably similar. Here's one of the writers, Joe Klein. I'm going to quote one paragraph from this article that he says, and now the American political establishment has been toppled. As a longtime member of that clan, I am writing from beneath the rubble. The view from here is rather limited. I don't trust myself to predict what happens next, although Trump's victory speech set a far more gracious and sober tone than anything he said or did during the campaign. It is also impossible, given his frequent policy shifts, to say what Trump will actually do as president. But it is possible to catalog some of the pillars that have fallen. The entire political consultant industrial complex has collapsed. Money raised and spent on advertising meant nothing. The use of market-tested language has become a liability, a sign of dull conformity on the part of the candidate. Focus groups, polling, the ground game, surrogates, and yes, sadly, truth have been shown to be irrelevant. Political parties have long been hollow vessels, but they now seem utterly archaic. So this is the impact of the election in 2016, and this is how Klein expresses it.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, this perception, and we see a similar thing this time around, but to me, the really interesting thing is the Democrats didn't seem to have learned from 2016. They think we see Trump as evil. We'll just keep saying he's evil. I mean, calling Trump Hitler or calling Trump Stalin, that's been kind of their leitmotif for the last 8 years. And for his entire first term, we had this kind of national temper tantrum by the left. And it didn't convince them. Now people say, well, the economy was actually doing pretty well. And also seeing this disjuncture between what was prescribed to us, the great unwashed during the pandemic, versus what the elite was able to do. And thinking it's a distrust. And you can see a similar distrust in the 1770s with the British government thinking, we know what's best for you Americans. And we're here to run an empire. You're a small part of it. And it was the resistance to that triggers, in many ways, the American Revolution, the resistance to the idea that someone else knows better for you. And we've seen this for most of the 20th century. The rise of progressivism has this inherent idea about having these elite groups, these disinterested boards, the bevy of platonic guardians in various commissions, committees who will regulate things, as opposed to having this turned over to the hands of, the people voting. And the people voting are able to respond, which they did last Tuesday. And see, so it's it's a persistent question we have about who's better to govern. In the inaugural address of Jefferson's that you began by talking about, he talks about this. He says, sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question. And that's the persistent question of who really should be in power. Should it be democratically elected people who do represent what we want? And, sometimes the people are wrong. I know about 47% of the American population now is saying, yeah, the people are wrong. You don't get very far in politics by saying that. But on the other hand, you have to find, so does that mean that Anouar Majid should be calling the shots, or I should be calling the shots, or someone else? I mean, how do you choose those who govern? That's been the big question. And to me, actually, getting back to the whole the American Revolution, we've seen lots of revolutions, in our lifetimes, and they start off with high expectations, and we know the bad old regime has to go. And that seems impossible. It seems impossible to topple Saddam Hussein or the Tsar of Russia or the Shah of Iran. But when you see the much more difficult thing is establishing a government that won't be worse. And one of the real triumphs of the American Revolution is they do create a system that isn't worse. And it allows us now, after 200 plus years, to continue fighting it out, sometimes getting it wrong, sometimes getting it right, but having this other way of choosing who governs. And ultimately, the power comes back to the people.
Yeah, that's right. And this is the question. I mean, why is it that, okay, and there's another thing, this perception, and it's true. It's not a perception, it's a reality. He's a very wealthy man, Donald Trump. And then as I read a few years ago, Victor Davis Hanson's book, The Case for Trump, he says that the both coasts and the Ivy League and the high tech industry, 99% of donations went to Clinton during that campaign. And he also said that the richest counties in the United States voted against him, and the poorest stuck with him.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how do you we do see a shift going on with, I think this may be one reason why Kamala Harris, it became kind of a meme. I grew up middle class, because he's trying to appeal to this group to which he's not part. And this is, you go to the wealthiest towns, this is where you see all of the signs about, I was just going past a house that probably sold for about $2 million, and there's a Harris Walsh for the people. And thinking, it's an interesting idea that we know best what the people should be doing. And in this election, we did see the people deciding something else. And I think that's the thing that really is puzzling and infuriating to the Democrats. They see Hispanic voters who are thinking for themselves, African American, people who they wanted to fall in line are not. But then the puzzling thing is, how come supposedly smart people like that you and I are surrounded with in academia don't see this? And parrot whatever the New York Times says. And if anyone is disagreeing, I know I have a colleague who wrote a book where he kept referring to the Wall Street Journal as a right-wing publication. That's interesting. It's a conservative publication, but dismissing anyone who's not on your side as being somehow an agent of a right-wing cabal. It's troubling, fascinating, and we'll see what happens over the next 4 years.
Well,
I'm beginning to think how Jefferson might have voted.
Yeah, I would love. I have a suspicion he might have, just like he did with Thomas Paine. Everybody else abandoned Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson was a little bit unsympathetic to him and so on. I feel he has that kind of mischievous temperament about him, and also he's genuinely a revolutionary type. In terms of he's constantly thinking about.
Yes. And seeing that things have to change, that is, return to, you have the original principles, but seeing that generations come and go and that we have to adapt. One generation can't bind another. And so that is, and thinking of revolutions in terms of revolving and rotating and not, I think we've been on this trajectory for much of the 20th century, this idea of continuous progress to some brighter future. And that we don't know what that future is. And also, I don't know if I believe in the inevitability of things getting better. Things also can get worse.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's something woefully inadequate about the language, the discourse we have to analyze political events and politics today. The that's the perception, for example, that the Republican Party is a Republican Party of 40 years ago.
Yeah,
Now. I mean, I've seen people actually, like commentators, describe it as a people's party. It's the working class.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
party for the working class, the blue collar working class. And what used to be the Democrats, the party for the working
yeah,
class and the blue collar workers, so on, has become a party of the cultural elites, not to
yeah,
mention the financial elites and so on.
yeah.
I mean, there's Musa Al Araib. It's a book that's coming out next year from Princeton University Press. It's talking about the ironies of this wokeism, which is basically the movement of this symbolic elite
Hmm.
who like their who shop from Amazon and do all kinds of things like that, Airbnbs and so on, but they don't care about the conditions of those delivery people
Right.
and the nannies and so on and so
Oh,
forth.
yeah,
So
yeah,
there's an interesting switch that's happened in the political landscape in the United States, but we don't have the adequate language, not to mention analysis, to explain this rapid change in its rapid political changes. I'll give you an example. Like, one of the books that had a big impact on me was a French guy who wrote. Is a geographer. It's called Guilly, I think his last name is. It's called The Twilight of the Elites. It was published in French and then was published in English by Yale University Press. And in it, it talks about how the elites, you don't even need to have to live in fenced communities, because the cost of 1 square meter in Paris is so
yeah.
it's so high that it's by definition it excludes 90% of the population, and
Right.
so the immigrants or the refugees come to live with the working class in their neighborhoods, and that's where the tensions happen. And so these elites, these French elites, look
Yeah,
down
yeah.
on their compatriots, the French working class, and call them racist and so on and so forth,
Right. Oh,
because
yeah.
they have to live those tensions. But meanwhile,
That's
they
right.
live in these mansions or these high, very super expensive neighborhoods
Yeah,
that simply do not allow for that,
yeah,
for that, yeah,
yeah. Well, we
mixing to
saw,
happen.
yeah, we saw a similar thing working out with the migrants coming in when the border opened in 2021, and when the governor of Texas sent groups of these migrants to Martha's Vineyard. The governor of Massachusetts reacted with horror at this. And just this past year in Roxbury, which is a working class, mainly African American Latino neighborhood in Boston, the community center was closed so we could house migrants. It's not happening in Brookline or in Newton or in Wellesley, the wealthier places. It's happening in Roxbury. And it happened there because, we think we can. And so can you dismiss these people as racists for seeing that their community center is closed or their schools are now filled with, children of migrants who, or the schools are actually taken over to house them, or there's a migrant shelter next to a school. Let's see this in Manhattan. But yeah, it's the rules apply to one group can do things because they have the means, and then the rest are kind of stuck. And this is, I think, the big problem here. And I think, calling something racist has become a new code for just saying it. Since fascists we recognize now that fascism is what Orwell said. It's something we find undesirable, and racism has really replaced that. And how can we grapple with this? They still see them referring to the Trump now being as racist, misogynist, and so on, when the evidence is really to the contrary. And so it's really a fascinating thing, and you don't know if the elites will wake up, or well, I'm sure they are woke enough, but what will? Yeah, again, as an historian, I can tell you more about what did happen than what will happen.
Yes. Well, what happened is fascinating. I said, what happened during the American Revolution. I mean, you could see echoes a little bit of that. I mean, that's why I wondered. I mean, if you had to play this game, if there was some sort of, contest or game, I mean, who would, Jefferson support or something
Yeah,
like that? I mean, I uh, anyway, so the question there for you as a historian, I know, but there's another thing that's interesting that's happening now with what is happening to him personally, the Donald Trump, the things that he went through in the process of campaigning for the or re-campaigning for the
Yeah,
presidency. The court cases and the
yeah.
so on. I mean,
That's
and that is, in a way, I mean, people on his side see it as profoundly anti-democratic and
yeah,
anti-American to block him by
yeah.
using by recourse to the courts and the law. What they call it,
Yes.
lawfare.
Lawfare. It is. It is. It's something very well. Well, in 18, Aaron Burr ran afoul of the Jefferson administration, and so Jefferson has him charged with treason, not for running afoul of him, but Burr might have been trying to stir up this plot to have the Western countries secede, have himself set up as emperor. Burr said, "No, I was just trying to invade Mexico, which would have been a good thing," but charged with treason. And this is one of these pivotal moments in in the history of the United States. What happens when one political figure runs afoul of another? Jefferson, we started off saying what a great guy he is, but then here he is, prosecuting his former vice president for treason. He's also trying, by the way, to impeach justices on the Supreme Court and replace them with ones who will be more in step with what Jefferson wants. And this is really a critical moment because what happens in this case is the Chief Justice, John Marshall, whom Jefferson really wanted to get off the Supreme Court, presides over this case of the former vice president charged with treason. And treason's the only crime defined in the Constitution. And Marshall, who typically took a broad view of what constitutional power was allotted, here looks at it very narrowly. And Jefferson is the guy who said we have to look strictly at the Constitution, what it says. So Marshall does that. And can't find that Burr has committed treason as defined in the Constitution. And so Burr is acquitted. You think, what would have been the consequences had Burr been convicted of treason and hanged? The law that would have been the beginning of lawfare. And that would have been what happens every time someone loses an election. And it is what happened in 2021. Almost immediately these prosecutions of Donald Trump for various things that are really stretches. The whole case in New York involving violating the campaign laws. But actually that's a state matter. It's a federal matter, but he's prosecuting in a state court. And all of these stretches, and then the whole civil fraud thing for a crime. No one was aware that he had defrauded him. He had said he was worth more than he was. And very few people in business wouldn't do that. So is that a crime? And trying to call, he was impeached actually for a phone call he has with Zelensky. And so you have this turning on using the system to get someone. And this is another thing that really drove a lot of the support for Trump. People who might have voted for Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley or someone else said, well, wait a minute, they're attacking him. And there's one of the great memes is Donald Trump saying, they're really not after me, they're after you, but I'm just in the way. And in many ways, so you have the whole turning of the legal system, the weaponizing of justice against him. And then one of the real ironies is that his opponents in the case, well, he'll weaponize the Department of Justice and the IRS. Well, they've already done that. It's a projection. They're accusing him of wanting to do things that they have done. And I think this is something that us mere mortals who are not part of the coastal elite kind of see through and wonder, what is next? And would he have been renominated had they not done this? I mean, their thinking is, we'll put him in jail. No one will vote for him because he's been in jail. And then I saw a lot of my good friends are posting pictures of him on Facebook wearing an orange jumpsuit or celebrating this, not seeing the real danger to the system, thinking that we will never be out of power and have this done to us. You open this up as a precedent that someone else can use, which is an alarming thing. So a dangerous thing, and it sets us down a path that certainly Jefferson wanted to avoid, Adams wanted to avoid, and yet here we are. We've survived for a long time without it, and is this such an unprecedented danger to the system? And you think about the line in The Man for All Seasons about, will you cut down all of the laws in England to get the devil? And then when the devil turns on you, what will you have to use against him?
Here's another issue of Time magazine from January 23rd, 2017, just after he was elected president. And there's an article here that uh, it's called Life at 1600. And it's one thing to be elected president of the United States. Learning how to do the job usually takes longer. So in one paragraph, it says, since Donald Trump's race for the White House was one long looping detour from convention, it's natural that the final lap has veered off road as well. Even veterans eager to help him find themselves challenged not just by his unfamiliarity with the ways of Washington, but also by his indifference to them. Whether it's his disdain of intelligence and analysts, his distance from his party's agenda, his Twitter torture of corporations, or his defiant and diversionary January 11 press conference, everything about the Trump transition has tested the machinery of power and protocol. This suggests that the weeks to come will involve a steep learning curve, not just for the new commander in chief, but for the rest of us as well. This was in January 2017.
Yeah.
It's almost like we have a Trump redux event happening in front of our eyes now.
Yeah. I have to say, I think, he wasn't as disorganized as they seem to think. And B, I think he has learned a lot. I think he's a smart guy. He's gotten very far in life, learning how to read people, situations, and also systems. Yeah.
Yes.
No one is going to argue that he's a Boy Scout and that, he's a man without sin. But learning how to do things is really an extraordinary thing. I was just reading the memoir by Wilbur Ross, his Commerce Secretary. He talks about the first time he's called into the Oval Office to talk about tariffs. And so they kind of disagree about how to implement tariffs. And then they talk about this. And then Trump suddenly opens his drawer, pulls out a couple of pens. There's a fat pen and a thin pen. He says, what do you think of these pens? They're the pens that the president uses to sign bills. Usually he gives them away as souvenirs.
Yes.
He says, which one do you like better? He says, it seems like, again, if you don't know Trump, he says, this is one of those crazy things where suddenly he's talking about something else. He can't focus. But then he said, and Ross says, knowing he likes to write with a big fat signature. I said, well, I like the fat pen. And Trump says, that's what I thought too. The Obama administration had spent $300 each for these pens. He said, I called the manufacturer and they said they could get them to us for less. But I think, well, these pens cost $20. Why don't we just get these? And then there's another, and then they go back to the tariff. And then something else comes up, also involving how much something costs. And Ross said, if you didn't know him, and Ross had dealt with him earlier in business. In fact, they had been part of antagonists in a lawsuit at one time. And Trump, he says, everything is related to how much things cost. How can we bring down the cost of government? So these trivial things, like how much does a pen cost, are related to this overall problem we have of the debt, how much the government is spending. And I think actually one of the big mistakes we made in 2020 by not reelecting him is we needed to get the economy started after the COVID pandemic. And he knows something about getting an economy going as a businessman, something that I have to say Joe Biden really doesn't, which is why the solution was let's throw a lot of money at things and do other stuff. But you have Trump who understands this business because he's been part of it. There was always a canard among folk. Well, I won't say a canard since my grandmother used to say, what we need is a good businessman. Often the skills you have in business aren't the same you need in politics. Herbert Hoover was a very good businessman and does rise to the top in a system that worked at that time. Trump's a businessman, but also can understand how things can work. And I think what people want, the average people like us, is things to work, a government that will, again, something else Jefferson says, that will restrain men from hurting one another, but otherwise leave them free to regulate their own affairs. Or as Ronald Reagan said, get it off of our backs and out of our pockets. And that is the way you generate economic growth. It's kind of what Jefferson saw too. You restrain the power of the federal government as a way of setting free the entrepreneurial aims of the American people.
Yeah, when you talk about Trump being a businessman, I always try to explain to people in my mind he is a businessman from another world, from a different world. I mean, nowadays we have business people from Silicon Valley, from Wall Street, but he comes from the world of real estate.
Yeah.
And in one of I read somewhere, in a book or some article, that he really his father had made sure that he understood every element of
Yeah.
the business, the
Yeah.
tools, the nails, the
Yeah. Yeah.
cement, and he was deep. I mean, he was deeply involved in that kind of job, including workers and so on and so forth. So that the business of real estate is very different from the business people, the tycoons nowadays who made money in the digital world, so to
Right.
speak. So it's
Yeah.
almost like coming from a pre-industrial world
Yes.
to a
Yeah.
post-industrial one.
Right. Yeah.
And so he's coming with that kind of mindset that the one you
Yeah.
described.
Yes, you're actually building something, as you have
Yes.
something at the end of the day to show for this. How many stories have you added? How much ground have you dug? These kinds of things. And also understanding, as you said, all of the people working in this system.
Yes.
The ones who are digging the foundation or the ones who are pounding the nails and what they are doing. And you need to keep them working at this. It's different from what Marx predicted about the future of, while capitalism would ultimately collapse of its own weight because we'll drive down the wages, you need to hire good people and who are able to do things and need to respect that what they are able to do. And I think that's one of the things you do see with Trump, just in his, various public appearances, where he is able to talk to ordinary people in a way that a lot of politicians are not. In fact, it's a kind of a curious thing because you think if you're in politics, your job is to engage with the public. And in business, you're not, but he is very good at that. You see him go into a barbershop, even when he was at McDonald's, talking to people there who were working there, but also to reporters. And I think this is one of the real disjointed things we have seen in this administration, as well as in the Obama administration, and not having press conferences and not engaging with the press in a way. Trump loves talking to people, so he'll talk to anyone. And it really has helped him as a politician, being able to talk. And some of the folks in journalism look for the crazy thing he's going to say, and that's going to become the headline. I saw a TV screen before the election about how he threatened to shoot Liz Cheney, and it turns out he actually said something else. He was speaking metaphorically about people, the neocons who get the country into a war, and they're not going to have to fight. So how would she feel having guns pointed at her is different from saying, I want to stand her up by a firing squad, which is what CNN was saying he had said. I think it's this kind of management or telling blatant lies that has led people who were distrustful of the elites to vote for Donald Trump, because you actually know that you can kind of see patterns in what he is saying. And I think it was Selena Zito who said he's meant to be taken seriously, not literally. And so understanding Trump, I guess, is something we all should try to do, but also understand, more importantly, what it is that appeals to people about him. Why it is that now 51% of the American people decided they wanted him back in the White House.
Yeah, one of the most absorbing books I read about him is by the people who ran his campaign, 2016 campaign, Cory Lewandowski and David Bossie. It's called Let Trump Be Trump. And I went back again to look at the notes I'd taken, and they conclude with this statement: Donald Trump is not, nor will he ever be, a part of the establishment. The book was published in 2017. He's not, nor will he ever be, a politician in the traditional sense of that word. And he's not someone who goes back on his word. For Donald Trump, loyalty is the currency of the realm. And nothing hurts him deeper than when someone he trusts is disloyal.
Right. Oh,
So,
yeah.
and the entire book is about how he employed his caddy, and now he turned his caddy into his Twitter-in-chief, or was like the guy who tweets out this. And the caddy had saved the $200 bill tips he gave him, Donald Trump had given him. So he has this relationship with the working class, and whom he trusts, and he expects reciprocity in that relationship.
Yeah. And it's not simply blind adoration. Seneca was a Roman philosopher who said that loyalty is the holiest good in the human heart.
Yes.
You can actually see that inscribed on a pillar in South Boston in Joe Moakley Park, because Joe Moakley was fond of that phrase. Loyalty is the holiest good in the human heart. That is, you're loyal to the people around you, and they're also loyal to you. It's this connection people want to have and should have with one another. So I think it's a very important thing, but it's not simply a blind devotion.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think it's one of the really fascinating things about him. And we know that a lot of his various political stances change. That is, he's not an ideologue, and at one time it was a good thing not to be an ideologue. Um, but he is thinking about what's not necessarily what's best for Trump. I think that's usually on his mind. But in this case, think about it. He's 78 years old. He's been successful in business, didn't have to get into politics, didn't have to run for president. And there is something about that. It goes beyond ego. In fact, if you get into politics, one of the first things you find is, it's important to have a self-esteem, but you're going to get clobbered, as he has. It's hard to think of anyone who has been more attacked than Donald Trump has been over the course of his political career.
I
And
cannot
so
think of
that's,
that.
well, why do this? And then you think, okay, so if you're agreeing with the left's point that he is simply driven by egotism, well, then what's driving all of these other characters? Like, Joe Biden kept running for president in 1988 and 2008, and then 2020, when he was a bit past his prime. What is it that keeps anyone doing this? And so that's, I think, one of the things. Well, we'll see over the next 4 years how this works out. I suspect that the second term will be different in a lot of ways. One, we know he can't run for reelection. And B, will the people he brings in will, I suspect, be more seasoned. I think he learned something in the first term about not hiring Omarosa or other people who are immediately going to go to the press when something goes wrong, which is, one of the things we did see in the first term. And of course, one thing I've observed over my long life is when someone on the right or a conservative suddenly turns, they become instantly a hero. There's nothing nothing more predictable that when some eminent conservative dies, you will see the liberal media talking about what a wonderful person he or she was, because they're not like whoever we have today. And they become temporarily a hero. Like Liz Cheney, I think, is a good example of this. Someone who's been presented to us now because she stood up to Trump and has a lot of other baggage. So we're in a very interesting moment, which we always are. And I'm more hopeful than I would have been, I think, last week.
Yeah, and that the fact that it causes a lot of confusion, not only in the United States but worldwide. For example, when I travel outside of the United States, one of the complaints people have about him is that the fact that I mean, I would that he's an isolationist, like he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't get involved in other people's affairs. He said, "Well, my immediate response to everybody who says that is, well, make up your minds. If American presidents get involved in other people's affairs, then
Yeah,
they're imperialists and they're
yeah,
hegemonic
yeah,
and
yeah,
they're
yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
on and so when Trump doesn't get involved, when he chooses not to get involved,
Yeah, yeah.
now you are disappointed. So
I know.
it's a very interesting.
It really
Uh,
is.
yeah.
And then, of course, another piece of this, too. I mean, he has been much more adamant about supporting Israel in this case. And then you think one of the major achievements in American diplomacy has been the Abraham Accords,
Mhm.
where Israel is making peace with the various Arab states. And that actually has great promise again to ending this conflict. And in many ways, we see what's happening now as Iran trying to use this. Iran really wants to be the hegemonic power in the Middle East. And so this is, I think, yeah, you're right. Choose. Do you want the United States to be involved or not to be involved? And then thinking in the terms of not what's in the best interest for people in some other part of the world, but what's in the best interest of the United States here. The best interest of the United States is not for the Soviet Union to take Ukraine, but how do we go about securing Ukraine without turning this into a wider war? And these are, complicated questions, but I think remembering what the motivation is here. By the way, it was, I think, on my visit to Morocco in 2016, when I saw you, that I began
Yes.
becoming a Trump supporter. As you asked the similar questions, and I had to
Yes.
respond, thinking thoughtfully about this. And so yeah, it's an interesting time in the world, and you also, I think, the American people also looked at the two candidates this time and said, who will have a better chance standing up to Xi Jinping or to Putin? The myth we were sold the first time around was he was an agent of Vladimir Putin,
That's
which
right.
is absurd. Yeah, as kind of a guy who sees himself as a strong man, naturally he would see some similarities with Putin, but also seeing, okay, the interests of the United States and the interests of Russia. In some cases, yeah, we may want similar things, but on the other hand, if we're adversaries, we're adversaries. And that's, I think, something, I think in the Obama administration, there was a tendency to try to, Obama's magnetic personality was supposed to wean these people from doing bad things in a very similar way to the way Jefferson's adherents thought he would be able to make the world a safer place just because of his magic of thinking about republicanism. And Jefferson's foreign policy at the end of his term was really kind of disastrous with the embargo, which it wasn't what we wanted to talk about, but maybe we'll get into trade problems and Jefferson's embargo. But yeah, it's a fascinating time, and we can kind of see how Donald Trump has puzzled a lot of people to hopefully rethink their assumptions. But on the other hand, I think the thing that appeals to the American people about him
Yeah.
isn't will other people in the world like him, because we're kind of used to other people in the world not liking us. And typically we don't apologize for that.
Well, it's like the same confusion that reigns in the United States, especially in the media and among the cultural elites. In the rest of the world is somewhat similar in the sense that they do not want American imperialism, but they want American patronage
Yes.
and protections and so on.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I used to always recommend his speeches at the United Nations. Every year he would go to the United Nations in New York, and he would explicitly, I mean, verbally would say, "Make your countries great again." I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
he like work, and
Yeah.
I was my job is to take care of American citizens,
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
your countries great again. But someone it somehow doesn't register as a great statement that he is championing other people's independence and so on and so forth. I mean, just
Exactly.
it's kind of frustrating.
Exactly. It's not saying we are the best you never will be, but seeing
Yeah.
this is really an opportunity for you. Similar, it really is a striking thing. When he says things about, I remember when he was running in 2016, he said something about how American cities are in bad shape. Immediately, oh no, our cities are in great shape. Or when he said, Haiti is having, I can't remember what phrase he used for it, but who would disagree? But that isn't to say you can't be better. They can't be better. But is it up to the United States to build Haiti up, or is it up to the people of Haiti to do this? And I think this is something Jefferson understood. The first thing you need to do is establish a stable government. And that is what I think, this is really the reason behind the Abraham Accords. Let's stop this fighting that's been going on among these countries and allow them to develop themselves, when they're not obsessed with, we have to destroy Israel, the one ally the United States really has in this part of the world. So that's, it is a very much, you're getting me again to thinking that Jefferson would have voted for Trump, because it's very much a Jeffersonian thing that, you leave people alone to solve their problems.
Yes.
And yeah, you do give them what Jefferson saw was trade was the real instrument the United States had. We can trade with others; they should trade with us. It was kind of his idea for North Africa. Why are these states why are they all fighting one another and fighting us when North Africa has the capacity to feed Europe? It was, in fact, the breadbasket of Europe. So how come these states are not we don't see what's happening in the United States happening here when they look to similar places, these coastal areas with agriculture, shipping, and so on, but they weren't developing as the Americans were. And it wasn't because these are worse people than Americans. It was because their governments and, of course, their religious establishment, as Jefferson thought, prevented them from doing this. So we see, and the fact that they were disunited. That's really one of the lessons Jefferson was getting out of North Africa in the first decade of the 19th century. And by the way, Anouar, I've really enjoyed reading what you've written, not only about that period, but about the post-Andalusian world and the real promise in at different times in world history that there has been that people could make their countries great again and make the world great again.
Since I have you, Bob, I cannot resist. I mean, RFK, the fact that so a year ago, I told everyone that the most intelligent by far presidential candidate is Robert Kennedy Jr. So
Yeah.
he's smart, he's well educated,
Yeah.
learned in a lot of different in history and in ways that there's no even comparison between him and the two other main candidates for the
Yeah.
presidency. And now he is on Trump's side.
Yeah.
He is with Trump, and Trump was able to bring him on his side. And he's given him free reign, except for oil, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
to manage the entire health industry, including taking on the pharmaceutical industry and taking all these big corporations and so on. So this is, to me, it is in this sense that when he was being compared to Sanders and so on, or me coming from a socialist Marxist background, when I see him, I see a very strong progressive force in the traditional sense. I mean,
Yeah.
he's not the corporate lackey. He's not. He's
Yeah.
never dependent on corporate support. He
Yeah.
is like a man of the people.
Mhm. It really is, really is. And again, recognizing that you have someone who is really talented, really smart, and bringing him on. That was a major thing in the election. It wasn't just getting him so he's not a third party candidate, and who knows from whom he would have taken more votes, but bringing him on because he has something he can bring into this. And that's one of the real arts in politics, is bringing in coalitions, creating, people who may disagree about some things, but bringing them in. And that's really the way Madison helped design the system, so that you will listen to divergent voices and be able to come up with solutions to problems. And that was a major event. And you don't see a similar kind of coalition building on the other side. This idea that the coalition will automatically form because we have the best ideas, when they don't. Maybe they don't. And if people disagree with us, this is why, by the way, I always caution my students never to vote for college professors, because we always know we're the only person in the room worth listening to. And we always like it when the students write down everything we say. And we also know at the end of the semester how smart they are, because if what they say agrees with what we have said. This is what college professors do. It's not really good for a politician to come in thinking I'm the smartest person in the room. And by the way, if at the end of the semester or at the end of the lecture, I ask you what I've just said, and what you say somehow is different from what I've said, what I do is I repeat what I've just said, but I use smaller words and I speak more slowly. The presumption is you're not smart enough to get this. And that I think is the critical condition the Democratic Party finds itself in now. I think, again, Victor Davis Hanson had an essay a few weeks ago about the lecturers versus the lectured at. It's how he sees this breaking down. The people who know what's best for us, what kind of car to buy, what kind of stove to buy, versus people who basically just want to get on with their lives. And that's work to make America great again, or make Morocco great again, or make Haiti great again. This is really the critical condition in America. And I'm skeptical that the Democratic Party will be wise enough to say, yeah, maybe we better change our tactic here.
Yeah, there's a lot of soul searching among Democrats now, which is very, very unconvincing. They spent the better part of a decade, doing the same things, and now that they've lost the election, I mean, it's like, anyway. One thing about Donald Trump, since we are trying to make sense of him, is he's not very articulate. I mean, he does not. So I don't know whether you would agree with me. To people who've always been puzzled by the way I talk about him, I try to explain what he thinks and what he does and so on. I said, if you want to understand Donald Trump, listen to Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's
It could be. Yeah. Yeah.
what do you think of that?
I think it's probably true, yeah. But I think you can parse from Trump, but then what he says is going to change too, or what his position on things. We always know that what he's doing, he's surrounded by himself with great people, really good people, and they're working on this. He does. I have to say one thing about Trump is he is always fascinating to listen to, and always very entertaining to listen to.
Yes.
I think sometimes they could have reined him in at sometimes and say, make this a half-hour speech instead of going off. But it's always interesting. I think that's one of the things that really has made him, 3 times a presidential nominee. By the way, I don't tell many people this, Anouar, and actually the fact that we're doing a podcast is another reflection on the kind of demise of the mainstream media or the legacy media. That there are voices like yours out here. But in my lifetime, I've only voted for a presidential candidate more than once, twice. That is, there have only been 2 presidential candidates I've voted for more than once. The first was Jesse Jackson, and the second is Donald Trump. Now, I don't know what that says about me or the political process, but
Yeah, it's just, that's exactly the Bob I know.
Again, another disruptor, another person who comes from outside and can and it actually infuriated people in the Democratic Party because the African Americans were simply supposed to fall in line and wait for whomever we anointed. And Jackson says, "Well, here I am," and was really fascinating. So I voted for him in '84 in the presidential primary. I was living in Arizona then, and he did get a delegate from Arizona at the Democratic convention from the district I happened to be living in. And then in Massachusetts, our favorite son, the governor, was running for president at that time. But again, it was having the Democratic establishment tell us who the anointed candidate would be, as opposed to here's a guy who comes in from outside and says, well, why not me? And similarly with, Donald didn't vote for Trump in the primaries in 2016 or this time, but for president, he's is offering something different, actually seeing that the system does need some disrupting, not changing the way the Democrats want to pack the Supreme Court, eliminate the filibuster, do other things to make it easier for them to pass their agenda, but changing it so we don't simply have a hereditary succession. The Clintons and the Bushes will transmit the office to their next generation. It's something different, and solutions have to come from the body of the people as opposed to from the editorial board of the New York Times or from the CEOs of Silicon Valley.
Bob, do you think we're in the midst of a political revolution in the United States, whether it's maybe the MAGA movement, does it constitute a revolutionary movement? Because it's definitely the Republican Party is no longer the party that of as I said, the party of 40 years ago, and so is the landscape is global? Are we witnessing? We are still witnessing the impact of globalization on citizens of democracies worldwide, not just in the United States, but in Europe and so other places where they keep electing what's considered, people on the right or right wing candidates and so on in so many countries. Is it because it has globalization, or like Patrick Deneen, whom I interviewed once, the failure of liberalism, has the economic model of globalization failed, and what we are witnessing now is the impact on American democracy, on the right of American citizens, and they need someone like Donald Trump to express their frustrations and to fight back. These economic models that are completely indifferent to the fate of the republic.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Then we do see this change going on. I think when we say that globalization has not delivered on its promises, that's one thing, or that it's the enemy. It's different from saying we want to isolate ourselves. We want to build a wall because we do want to build a wall, but that's a different story. You have this, because the United States always has been engaged with the rest of the world through commerce. And wanting this kind of trade relationships and so on, but also wanting, reciprocity, or wanting to protect our industries or our country, not saying, okay, we're going to open everything up. As NAFTA did, create this one big trade zone, which actually did have severe implications, both in the United States, helped Mexico and Canada more. But Trump renegotiated that with agreements with each instead. So it's not okay. We're done with the rest of the world. I do think we see a similar thing in Europe with the creation of the European Union. And in many ways, that's an essential thing for Europe to, we know that for most of the previous 300 years, the European states have been fighting with one another, and the 20th century with really devastating effects. So the European Union is good in that regard. But then having a group of bureaucrats in Brussels telling people in Italy what they can do, or in England what they can do, is what provoked this other reaction against that idea. In a similar way that you had the Soviet Union imposing on the states of Eastern Europe, as well as on the various parts of what had been the Russian Empire, a kind of monolithic idea. And it's that thing. And in the United States, we see a similar thing. It was a brief moment, really, from the end of World War II until really the 1990s, that it was that the United States emerged as this global hegemon. And so it's this idea of power that the United States was only just getting used to. And as the United States found, people who are experiencing power from a hegemon often aren't simply happy with this turn of events. It's Kipling says something to this effect in his poem about taking up the white man's burden. It's not that they're not going to thank you for this. You're going to be despised by these people. And I think that's one of the problems we see with globalization. And of course, of globalization, as we now know it, it's not as though there is a global hegemon determining how the world will be governed. It's simply opening up borders and so on, opening up trade relations. And it is an unsettling thing. And I'm not saying change is always bad. Change is always difficult and painful. And the problem is not knowing where we're going. I mean, what is the end of this? Is the end so that my life will be better, or that someone in Brussels or Geneva or at Oyster Bay in New York, at Turtle Bay, will be able to tell me what I should be doing? It's wanting to be left alone, which Louis Brandeis said was the most fundamental of all human rights, all human desires, was the desire to be left alone.
And since we know that Donald Trump is against forever wars, and let me now rephrase the question differently. Maybe I should ask a different question now. Would George Washington have voted for him?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of course, Washington, as you know, I think this is what you're getting at, in 1796 announces he's not running for president again, and sets a precedent, by the way, for 2 terms, and then you're done. And he also gives a warning about, it's not simply about foreign entanglements. It's about a political party taking the interest of a foreign nation over our own. Why quit our own and stand upon foreign ground? That is, he saw that England and France are the world's superpowers, the global hegemons of the time. And each one had an interest in who was in power in the United States. And you did see the 2 political parties in the United States in the 1790s. The Republicans, Jefferson's party, were very much pro-French. The Federalists were more pro-English, although when Washington proclaims neutrality in the war between England and France, the Republicans have a fit, because they, of course, wanted to go to war against England on the part of France. And Washington proclaims neutrality, which is what leads then the French to start attacking the Americans. So Washington sees this. Getting into these entanglements is a way of undermining your own political sovereignty. And that was the big problem. And one of the fascinating things about Washington is that during the Civil War, as a fundraising thing, on Washington's birthday, in the Senate chamber, they read Washington's farewell message. And again, the message also has this real plea for national unity. The first part of the address actually had been written by James Madison, and talks about the need, each section of the country needs the other sections. And this was a new idea in the 1790s, this idea of creating this fragile union. So the Senate reads Washington's farewell message in 1863 and then starts doing it every year since. Since the 1880s, a member of the Senate convenes on February 22nd to read Washington's message warning about partisanship, and that ultimately what's going to happen is someone will raise himself up on the ruin of public liberty to a position of power, and using influence from England or France to secure this. And he also warns about excessive partisanship. He says it's a flame that can't be quenched, and it does have to be tampered, else instead of warming, it will consume. That is, partisanship is the big enemy here. Mm-hmm. So imagine this. Every year the Senate hears this warning about partisanship, this warning about entanglements. And so they meet on February 22nd, they read the message, and then they adjourn, and then they go back to doing what they've been doing. And we keep hoping one year they will get the message. And by the way, every senator then writes them a little book about what he or she thought as they were reading the message. And it's been interesting to read. In 1956, I think it was, Hubert Humphrey read the message, great champion of liberalism in the 20th century. The following year, Barry Goldwater read Washington's message. It speaks to everyone, and each one wrote. Humphrey was a man who couldn't stop talking. I know I'm probably not the person to criticize someone else for not being able to stop talking. But so we have this warning from Washington. Would he have voted for Donald Trump? I think he would have understood Donald Trump in a way that a lot of others don't. Would he have seen him simply as a demagogue? I don't know. He certainly would have understood this message about the interests of your country come first. Mm. And the interests of, remember, Washington had his beginning. He had been a surveyor, and then his real formative experience was as commander of the Continental Army, where his task for 8 years was to keep this army together, even though Congress wasn't paying them. Congress was constantly arguing about trivial things, and his job is to keep this army together, not so that it will fight. And in fact, his real genius was in avoiding major battles, because he knew if he gets into a battle with the British army, which is better than his, they would probably lose. But in keeping it together so they could attack when they can, but otherwise have this as a constant threat to the British. So Washington, and again, someone else who was written off by smarter people like Jefferson as not having any real ideas, he had a certain genius for what he was doing that absolutely infuriated some of his opponents, some others who were challengers, like John Adams, who was probably brighter than Washington, but Washington had a charisma that didn't speak by simply running out and saying, I'm George Washington. It was a steady presence. Mm. And I think it's a character that we seek. It's one reason why, Washington is still the greatest among the chief executives for this, for understanding what his role was. And I think just getting back to the present moment, those who worry that Trump is somehow going to be a dictator, just keep in mind that the real premise of the movement, what had been conservatism, which is now, Trump isn't a conservative. I remember in 2016 having to tell some of my more liberal friends that Trump is not a conservative, and they were just, is to have this system that will let you do things and not tell you what to do. And so it's hard to be a dictator if your fundamental premise is you want people to be able to do what they want within limits. That is, so they're not injuring one another. And that's a greater promise than we want our hands on the federal levers of power so that we can implement various things that are going to tell you what kind of car to drive, what kind of stove to have, where your children can go to school, other things. So that's, I think, the fundamental difference we see between the two political parties today. I still haven't answered your question about how Washington would vote, because the short answer is I don't know.
No, I gave you two options, Jefferson and Washington. But what I'm getting from your answers, and they're very enlightening, is that the American Revolution is a work in progress. It's never ending, and you could see. So that's why I am very excited about the future, in the sense that we don't know the outcome of this, the Trump's election, the MAGA movement, and will there be any rethinking of of economic globalization and its impact on the United States and its citizens, or those kinds of questions that had been raised in a, let's say, by Boris Johnson in the case of
Hmm.
Brexit,
Yeah.
and very, very, very intelligently. I
Yeah.
mean, I think, but but politics is not a necessarily a game for very intelligent people, and
It isn't. I
so
think that's also one of the really striking things about the generation of the revolution. You had
yes,
people who were. I mean, this is where the really smart, ambitious people went. You know,
yes,
Jefferson, Madison, Washington, John Adams. Today, they don't go into politics, which is too bad. I wish more smart young people would get into politics. Instead, they go into business, or they become lawyers and not politicians, or they become professors like but there really is a need for people. Now, I'm not saying simply smart people, they should be governing us, but
mhm,
people with ideas and people then who are able to respond to ideas. I think that was one of the real problems the Democrats have had, is not having candidates who can do that and can think. You know, you think someone like, Bill Clinton was a genius politically,
mhm,
and Newt Gingrich has a Ph.D. in history. And
mhm,
I'm not saying we're better off when there are intelligent people running everything, but engaged in the process and really part of it. And as on city councils or on state legislatures, which is really where important things happen. And that's where your focus should be politically, is what's happening on the local level. And
right,
Joe Moakley, the late congressman from South Boston, said that being a member of Congress is like living in a neighborhood. You think about the people upstairs, downstairs, and over the back fence. And this is what Tip O'Neill said about all politics being local, really thinking about these local connections people have. And Moakley said that expands to the people in the next county, the next country. I mean, you're thinking about this neighborhood that we're all in. The fact that here you and I are sitting on opposite sides of the Atlantic talking about these issues that involve the whole world. It's really something that is essential for the survival of not only of the American system, but of our life as a species. And
yeah.
it's these kinds of connections that I really find heartening, even as we think about, globalization as a bad thing. Here we are, in different parts of the globe, but able to talk about these things.
You're talking about. I mean, it's a shame that we don't have more intelligent people going into politics. But I'm very also disappointed by the fields of people in education and culture in general. I mean, when Trump was elected, I did my very best to understand him. I mean, I
Hmm.
didn't know him very well, so I
Yeah,
read as much as I could, and not just listen to the media and trust what they
yeah,
say. Same thing with Boris Johnson. I mean, even there was a time when I was reading and people were giving me bad looks at Starbucks in Maine. I was reading Jesse Ventura's books.
okay.
I was fascinated by Jesse Ventura. He's one of the two independent
Hmm.
governors in the
Oh
country,
yeah, yeah,
besides King
yeah.
in Maine. I mean, to be elected, to be an independent or libertarian elected governor in the state of
Oh
Minnesota,
yeah,
I mean, that was an incredible achievement in
it
itself.
was.
Even though
Oh
he didn't
yeah,
have a
yeah.
lot of support, political support, but he managed to. So he wrote a book after he was elected called "Don't Start the Revolution Without Me," and it's a wonderful book, and
Oh,
it shows the spirit of this American man
oh
who,
yeah.
like, who was a Navy SEAL. I think he went to community college. He's a typical. He had a typical American journey, and yet, the fact that he was a wrestler. And he
Yeah, yeah,
continued. He said, "I want." He talked about keeping his daytime job because politics is.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And, and people thought it was just like shocking to people that he was saying that. I
yeah,
mean, that
yeah.
in fact to me he was adhering to Jeffersonian notion of democracy and citizenship, maybe to the letter.
Right. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. You do something, but then you also have done something else. That is, as a
Yes,
career and seeing, okay,
yes,
rising the ladder. What'll I do if not this? There's a great movie that came out in the 40s about called "The Senator Was Indiscreet." It's a United States senator who decides he wants to run for president, and it turns out he can't do anything else. He can be a senator, but doesn't know anything else. I think we need people who know something else, and that's one of the things Donald Trump brings, is he does know something else. Is he's been in another world. It's not like you have to have been, going through this system if maybe the system isn't working and maybe the people who it's producing aren't the best. We kind of do see this on the Democratic side. I mean, who else is there? You go outside this narrow pool and you add to it. It's one of the other geniuses of America is we're not simply using the same stock that came here in 1620 or 1630. We're bringing in new people with new ideas. And
Yes.
that's, I think, one of the things that makes for a healthier system. It's not we keep doing things the way we always have done them, but we are able to adapt. And sometimes it does need someone from outside the system to be able to do this and say, what you've been doing is wrong. Or why don't it's really a change. This is the essence of democracy. That is taking different ideas and seeing how they will work. And it's one of the great things about having a system where you have 50 states where these things can be worked out. That is, we need people in various political offices. One of the saddest things I see is when there's only one person running. So what kind of a debate is there? A dialogue is there? What kind of issues are being discussed if everyone is on the same page? I think this is yet getting back to problems we have currently in the United States, having the entire press essentially on one side.
Yeah.
And not able to think about other ways of doing this without demonizing those who might disagree. That is, there are legitimate arguments on all sides of this coin. Bernie Sanders has a point of view, and God love Bernie Sanders. He's been consistent over his whole political life. And then Ron DeSantis has a point of view. And so that's kind of a drawing in these things and seeing what will work instead of saying what one side is automatically right or wrong. Each side has talked about liking bipartisanship. You get the sense from, we always got the sense with Obama, he liked bipartisanship if the other side agreed with him. And less so, maybe they have a good idea. So that's been it is one of the consistent challenges of the system. As it exists in the United States, that it is a system of give and take, of having to listen to the other side. And as Jefferson again said in that inaugural address, that we believe strictly in rule by the majority, but the minority have their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate which would be oppression. So that's the idea here. Yeah, the majority governs, but you do have to listen to the minority, recognizing, as Madison said, that minorities can become the majority. That is, you don't have a permanent majority, permanent minority. Instead, you have a fluctuation, and you have to have this give and take for any kind of a system to survive.
One last comment question. Talking about Jesse Ventura and probably also Donald Trump, they had a connection together for a while and so on. It makes me think of the idea now completely almost forgotten idea of public service. When I try to explain to people what Jesse Ventura was saying, he's keeping his day job as a wrestler or whatever. Yeah. I mean, the notion you go into politics to do public service, not to make of it a career,
right?
And to enrich yourself and so on.
Yeah.
And so that notion, with all the people running for office, people in the Senate for decades, and people, and so on. So we have Jesse Ventura, who did this, he believed firmly in this notion, and now we have Donald Trump, who doesn't take a salary, and I don't think he has any plans after his presidency to do anything else. So this notion of public service that now gets transformed into notions of the deep state or whatever. I mean, that people stay in their political office for decades and then make huge amounts of money. And that is, would you say that's contrary to the founders' notion of a democratic republic?
Absolutely, it is. The idea of careerism definitely is.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter what your political point of view is. Having someone in for, 18 years in the Senate or 40 years in the Senate isn't what anyone would think is a healthy thing. There used to be this kind of adage in Boston politics that you move up or you move out. And one thing that kept Boston, but Boston may have a reputation for political corruption, but actually it hasn't. And one reason is there is so much competition for political office that if you step out of line, someone else will see you. And that's one of the things that has made it a healthy and a vibrant place. And so moving up, moving out, and you could do something else and have, it's dangerous just to have all lawyers in Congress. Why not have people who've done other things or
Real estate.
And H.L. Mencken, my favorite journalist, said that we actually should choose members of legislatures the way we choose jurors. You get a notice in the mail that you're going to be on a jury. And he said, jurors work very hard trying to get this right. And they focus on what they're doing. And then they go home at the end. So maybe members of legislatures, you get a notice that, okay, you're in the main legislature this month. So you and the others will go there, think, what do we need to do? Get it done, and then go home. It's an interesting idea. I don't see any legislature adopting that because it does become a careerist thing. And yeah, we talked earlier about focus groups and other things. That quote you read about, the first Trump election kind of demolished that whole idea. Maybe next, people often say term limits would be a good thing. I'm kind of against that idea just in principle, but maybe it would be if there's no other way to get these people out. We saw in this last election, a couple of long-term senators were voted out by their constituents. And, who knows, maybe the replacements will work out, maybe they won't. But having change is a good thing. But it really begins not with mandating this, but with having more people seeking office, more people out there saying, well, these are my ideas. What do you think? Or what are your ideas? And having that kind of exchange of ideas rather than, here's a job that I want. I had a good friend who was in Boston politics, and he used to say, you don't go in because you want to have a job, you go in because you want to do a job. And that should be the ethic, as opposed to, I couldn't think of what else to do. Okay. So I became a college professor.
Well, Bob, you and I have endless things to share and talk about. We're going to stop here just because I know you're busy and there's 6 hours between us. I'm in Morocco, so I hope to continue this conversation with you on other topics.
Sure.
Thank you. I mean, it's a pleasure to see you, even though via whatever video. But I hope to see you in person soon.
So do I, Anouar. Thank you so much, Anouar. It's great to see you, and best to the family.
Thank you.